All right, glad to be here. Thank you guys for sticking around. Hopefully this will be pretty fun. A lot of this has been touched on in certain areas, but hopefully I think this will kind of cover a number of things that we've touched on with different speakers in an interesting perspective. So I think an alternative title for this presentation could be In Defense of Science. And today I would venture a guess. I think it's going to be a pretty fair opinion in this room. People have immediate intense skepticism if you ever hear the phrase, trust the science, right? Anybody feel good about that? Does that give you confidence? Does that inspire you to, right? So, from the COVID lockdowns to climate change catastrophes that just never occur, appeals to the authority of science have been abused very clearly for political and social control. I think more people see that now than in many years. But it's important to realize this is not at all new. We've had multiple generations now where we've had a vastly anti-human, anti-progress ideology masquerading under the banner of science, using the authority of the name science in the form of radical environmentalism. That's been going on for generations now. For centuries, we've had attempts to diminish and dismiss mankind and human creativity as insignificant in the cosmos. Right. If you go to any academia today, Bruce and Tony touched on this, and Bob touched on this. If you go to academia today, that's the systemic dogma. And for millennia, we've had attempts by an elite to deny the ability of the masses to develop and express their creative potential. What we come to call the oligarchical system is expressed as far back as the legend of Prometheus in Prometheus's battle against Zeus. Again, things we've heard here today. So here, now we want to look at some of these most fundamental questions, but freed from this oligarchical ideology. And we want to ask, if we dismiss all this bad dogma, this ideology, what does science really say about mankind's place in the universe? Now, I would assert we live in a creative and developing universe. And as far as we know, aside from God, the creator, we, mankind, are the highest expression of creativity in that universe that we know of. And we're going to explore that through, what we know about that creative and developing universe through a specific metric that Lyndon LaRouche developed, which he called energy flux density. Now, in its most general form, energy flux density might sound like a confusing term, but it's just simply measuring the energy used by a system or a process per time per constituent part. So you could measure that energy used per time per mass or per volume or per capita, just depending on what kind of system you're measuring. And today we'll be looking at things in terms of kilowatt hours per year per kilogram. You could choose other metrics. But what's fascinating about this metric is that we'll see everything from the development of stars and galaxies on the largest scales astronomically, to the evolution of life on Earth and the biosphere, to human society. All these vastly different systems are measured by what appears to be a universal metric of progress we call energy flux density. So, starting with the astronomical, for both the evolution and development of entire galaxies and individual stars, we measure changes in energy flux density. For galaxies, the evolution from the earliest stages of formation to well-formed and developed galaxies like our own is measured by about a 50-fold increase in this metric. However, most of this development of galaxies is determined by the stars that compose the galaxies, with the least developed stars operating at a level 10-fold above the most developed galaxies. Remember, we're talking about measuring per unit mass. So even though a galaxy as a whole is far more energetic in absolute terms, if you take this specific metric we're looking at here, per unit mass, stars are significantly higher. And for a typical star, from its initial formation stage through various stages of development to the end stages of its life cycle, this developmental process is measured by about 100-fold increase in the energy flux density of a star. Now, this development of stars is powered specifically by nuclear fusion through the combining of lighter elements into heavier elements, and this is how the universe actually came to have the entire periodic table that we have here today, that all life, everything on Earth depends on. The oxygen we're breathing now, the carbon in our bodies, this was literally produced by stars going through their life cycles. These more complex elements wouldn't exist without the activity of these stars. And this is specifically what you call a negentropic process, a process creating more organized states with higher potential. For example, if we look at the combination of two hydrogen atoms to create a helium atom through fusion, the entropy of the helium atom considered by itself is actually less than the entropy of the two hydrogen atoms. Or similarly, when 3 helium atoms combine to form 1 carbon atom, the carbon atom actually has a lower entropy. Now, if you consider the energy released by the process, any academic would scream to make sure we insist the total entropy does go up, and that is true when you consider the energy release. But what's fascinating is that we have a very clear and undeniable increase of regional local negentropy, an increase in complexity, an increase in potential as the stars move through their life cycle. So stars are acting as what we might call negentropic agents, shaping the material and energetic characteristics of galaxies. And we see this, this has kind of been realized theoretically for a long time, but we see this with recent results from the James Webb Telescope, which are showing us very clearly that if you look at the earliest galaxies that we can see, you can directly, and you can measure the different elements in those galaxies. We see that they have significantly fewer heavier chemical elements, showing us that like we thought, the periodic table, right, the complexity of the periodic table is built up over time by successive generations of stars. So the James Webb Telescope confirms stars act as negentropic agents, defining the material and the energetic characteristics of entire galaxies. And I would argue similar to how life acts to shape the biosphere. Now, if we're talking about life in the biosphere, if we just look at, for example, the last 500 million years since the so-called Cambrian explosion, the emergence of kind of the modern mode of advanced life, this eon is divided into 3 eras, which are very loosely can be referred to as the age of the amphibians, the age of the reptiles, and the age of the mammals. So if we take an example, amphibian, we start out for that species at an energy flux density, again, our universal metric here, which is actually 7 times higher than an entire star. Again, obviously a star in totality in absolute terms is vastly more energetic. But if you're talking about per unit mass as a developing system, life is actually has a higher energy flux density. And as we look through the evolutionary process, reptilian species have twice the level of the amphibians, and the mammalian species, representing the most recent of these geological eras, is about 30 times higher the energy flux density of the reptile. Now, admittedly, just looking at singular species, that's a bit of a rough assessment. A better metric would be the energy flux density of the biosphere as a whole. And it is interesting, we can see at least one recent study which estimated accounting for all animal life, plant life, microbial life all together, looking at the energetics of the biosphere as a totality, the living matter of the biosphere as a totality. It was estimated to be roughly between the level of our example reptile and mammal there. So even if we look at the biosphere as a whole, we can see still a higher level of development than our astronomical processes. Now, I'm not aware of any attempts to estimate the energy flux density of the biosphere in its totality over these previous evolutionary eras. but there's definitely plenty of evidence indicating that the energetics of the biosphere have been increasing clearly over time. And we could make a very rough assumption and set these past evolutionary biospheres in their totality roughly proportional to our example species. And given what I've seen, I think this is, from other evidence, I think this is not an unreasonable hypothesis. So, as with stars and the galaxies they define, the progress and development of life over these hundreds of millions of years of development is measured by its level of energy flux density. The complexity, the potential is measured by this metric. Further, like stars, living organisms' life act as negentropic agents, defining the material and the energetic characteristic conditions of their sphere of influence, so to speak, the biosphere. Thus, the biosphere is characterized by what you could technically say a level of chemical disequilibrium, again, a level of negentropy, which requires constant output, constant activity of life to maintain a certain level of chemical disequilibrium or negentropy. And this has actually been measured relatively recently at a level of around 200 terawatts of power required to sustain the current levels of chemical disequilibrium in the biosphere. That's 70 times total current global electricity consumption. And that's over 200 times what could be possible without the action of life, right? So life is creating a level of negentropy, of disequilibrium, which creates certain sources of free energy and higher potential and higher complexity, which would not exist without life acting as a negentropic agent. So this takes us to mankind and physical economy, where our metric of energy flux density was actually first developed by Lyndon LaRouche, studying economic processes as early as 1980. And continuing in our universal graph here, we see that a purely biological existence of mankind, hypothetically mankind just existing biologically, is comparable to the energy flux density of a representative mammalian species. It's not anything super significant. However, since the beginning of the use of fire, we see mankind depart from a merely biological existence. And at least according to one study, we could say that the agricultural stage of development as a general concept in the progress of mankind has an energy flux density that's 4 times higher than a merely biological existence and 20 times higher than the biosphere. An industrial society is 3 times that of an agricultural, and a technological society is 3 times that of an industrial. Again, we see this continued progress. For more modern economies, I preferred a slightly different approach, measuring the stages of development according to the primary fuel sources that power that physical economy. And we can look at the history of the United States as an example of this. Looking at, for example, the peak of a wood-powered economy in like the mid-1800s to the peak of a coal-powered economy by the early 1900s corresponded to a doubling of the energy flux density of the U.S. economy as a whole. The transition from coal to a peak of oil and gas power in the 1970s nearly doubled that value again. Now, beyond that, we've really failed to develop the true potential of nuclear fission and fusion power. We've all been discussing here today the policy failures that have led to this lack of development. But just from what we can see so far here, we can clearly identify mankind as a new, unique type of negentropic agent in the universe, acting to generate the highest levels of energy flux density we see in the universe, at least according to our concept of looking at developing negentropic systems. Now, I think this is a fascinating process that you can put all this in one coherent perspective, looking at all these different vastly different systems and looking at them together as part of one coherent metric. But up to this point, this is an objective description and measurement of what we know about the universe. showing us that the overall complexity of the universe is the product of what we could say a nested set of developing systems, from galaxies to the biosphere to physical economy, each characterized by their respective negentropic agents, from stars to living organisms to mankind, the actual agents that create each of these domains. Now, the more difficult challenge is understanding the underlying causality, how this happens, why this happens, and realizing a profound truth that the oligarchy hates perhaps more than anything, that mankind's own creativity, our ability to develop, human cognition, is actually representative of the nature of the universe as a whole. That this is actually our most accessible insight into the true nature of the universe is human creativity itself. Now, we could look back to Aeschylus's telling of the Prometheus legend in Prometheus Bound for some insights into this. Prometheus, if you've read Aeschylus's play, Prometheus actually brings all forms of knowledge to mankind: astronomy, cooking, arts, agriculture, and so on. But the story centers around the stealing of fire from the gods. And Prometheus is known specifically as the fire bringer. Now, isn't fire, under the control and use by mankind, an expression of energy flux density? For the earliest expressions of mankind, we can look back to the use of fire to accomplish tasks to improve the conditions of life, providing warmth, cooking food, allowing for improvements in tool making, and so on. These activities, through the use of fire, actually changed mankind's ability to exist in the natural world. These are activities that changed mankind's relation to the natural world. So rather than our relation to the natural world being solely mediated by our biology and our instincts, like the animals, we see the emergence of a superior mediating factor of the human mind, human intellect, human creativity. But for this creativity to be expressed and sustained throughout society, we require the use of fire as a externally controlled energy flux density, supporting a new and unique form of material and energetic relation with the natural world, what we call physical economy. A new regime of negentropy that is the expression of human creativity on a societal and generational scale. So, with this perspective, we can very clearly, simply, and rigorously define the distinction of mankind from the animals. By our universal metric of energy flux density, this definition would be the negentropic agent with the ability to use an externally controlled energy flux density, which defines a new region of characteristic negentropy. Thus, the very nature, existence, and definition of mankind centers around changing the natural world and bringing increasing levels of the natural world under the domain of mankind's negentropic sphere of influence. That's what it means to be human. And in here, we can see the scientific validity of Genesis 1:28. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So jumping to today, what is the present impact of mankind with respect to Genesis 1:28? Well, there was a 2023 study that I think is fascinating that concluded that mankind today has doubled the energy flux density of the biosphere in its totality. Today it's twice what it would be if mankind was not acting as a unique force on the biosphere. Now, to be fair, this level of change isn't necessarily unique, right? The energy flux density of the biosphere has clearly doubled many times before over evolutionary time, as you see the transition from the age of amphibians to the age of the reptiles to the age of the mammals, right? But what is the underlying cause? Prior to mankind, any doublings of the energy flux density of the biosphere have been created by the evolutionary changes of life, of living matter, over millions of years of change, of evolution. Mankind has created this change, this doubling, in only a few thousand years, not through biological evolution, but as a function of the development of his physical economy. Further, the specific level of development of physical economy that enables mankind to double the energy flux density of the biosphere specifically requires fossil fuels to power that level of physical economy. Now, I think this is interesting. What are fossil fuels? They're the product of millions of years of biological activity. Fossil fuels are an expression of biospheric activity over evolutionary time. And what is the characteristic of the action of doubling the biospheric energy flux density? Well, that's an expression, it has been an expression of biospheric activity over evolutionary time. So I think this hints at an interesting idea, an interesting coherence, which points at a new way to understand and measure mankind's existence in the universe, the nature of mankind's existence in the universe. According to our universal metric of energy flux density, mankind is generating an action not otherwise seen except over evolutionary time. And doesn't this mean the appropriate measure of the current stage of mankind is an evolutionary biospheric force? Now, this framework lets us also broadly define certain necessary parameters of future development. If we look beyond our current stage, what are we moving towards? Now, is it a coincidence that the next great stage of mankind's development encapsulates both nuclear power and the colonization of space? As fossil fuels are the product of the biosphere over evolutionary time, for the most part, fission and fusion fuels are the products of stellar processes over successive generations of stars over stellar and galactic time. As a fully developed fossil fuel powered physical economy is the representation of mankind as an evolutionary biospheric force, a fully developed nuclear fission and fusion powered economy will be the representation of a mankind capable of bringing the solar system and beyond under his regime of negentropic control. So now we're looking towards the next great transition of mankind from a biospheric evolutionary force to the very beginnings of what we might call an astrospheric force, clearly defining a mission for mankind today. So, to review, we live in a universe that is composed clearly of nested processes of creative development, characterized by increasing complexity, increasing potential, generated by the actions of negentropic agents. That's really the source of all complexity, all development in the universe as we know it. And within that process, mankind is a unique negentropic agent, expressing powers we call creativity, science, knowledge. But this isn't just about understanding facts about the natural world. That's not what we're talking about. Human creativity has a specific expression. The expansion of the sphere of mankind's negentropic impact over increasingly larger domains into increasingly more fundamental systems composing the development process of the universe, from the biosphere to the evolutionary biosphere to stellar systems and beyond. Mankind is encapsulating, expressing, and representing the creative nature of the universe in increasingly more fundamental and more powerful ways. And I would say that is a scientific expression and definition of the idea of mankind made in the image of God. And I would argue that is what a healthy scientific perspective shows us, when science is not corrupted by oligarchical ideology, right? When we say trust the science, we should mean trust mankind is made in the image of God. not what Fauci says. So perhaps in a roundabout way, I think we've provided some new perspectives into a fascinating classical philosophical notion that human creativity is actually more representative of the nature of the universe than any fact or observation we make, right? Tell that to an academic, their head might explode. That's not my idea. That goes back to Plato and Plato's doctrine of recollection, right? That goes back to Kepler and his notion of universal harmonics, right? Any serious great thinker, even Einstein, had similar ideas when he was pondering causality in the quantum domain. Great thinkers have returned to a very profound question about the nature of human knowledge itself. Can mankind come to know truths about the universe? And if so, how is that possible, given the incredibly limited nature of our sense perceptions, the way we interact with the universe through our sense perceptions? How can we actually come to know the universe, given the limitations there? And from the perspective we've developed here, whatever human creativity is exactly, its characteristic expression through physical economy is clearly the emulation of the creative processes that compose the universe itself. And physical economic processes become a proof of the coherence between human creativity and the underlying nature of the universe as a whole. So that is how we should see science when it's freed from, again, oligarchical corruption, as an investigation of mankind's true place in the universe. So thank you.
Thanks for watching. Please take a moment and subscribe to our free newsletter at PrometheanAction.com.